to approve, please?
Lindstrom so moves.
Vento seconds.
Thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none. Michelle, please call the roll on the motion.
Yes, I will, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That motion carries. So we will move right into the business items. The first is 2020-131. It's a joint committees item. It's the City of Prior Lake 2040 Comprehensive Plan and Comprehensive Sewer Plan. And Raya Smiley will give the presentation. And committee members, before Raya gets going, I am going to try restarting my computer, so I'm going to go away for a minute. So if something happens, council member,
do you have that on somewhere? Oh, okay.
Ms.
Thank
Smiley.
you, Chair Lilligren, council members. My name is Raya Smiley. Oh, let me make sure that everyone can hear me, by the way. Is the sound okay? Okay, great. I'm Raya Smiley. I'm the sector representative for District 4, which includes most of Scott and all of Carver counties in local planning assistance and community development. I would like to thank the City of Prior Lake's Community Development Director, Casey McCabe, that I had the pleasure of working with on this comp plan. I truly appreciate the city's hard work on this. While Casey is not actually like on this call, like he wouldn't be able to answer a question. I believe he had mentioned that he's going to call in to listen. So I just want to extend my thanks to him. Before you today is the review of the City of Prior Lakes 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Next slide, please. Hopefully you can't hear an echo now. This map that is before you is figure 1 of the staff report and identifies the location of regional system components with the City of Prior Lake. There's 1 lift station, 1 interceptor, the Spring Lake Regional Park, Spring Lake Regional Trail, Scott County Regional Trail, and Prior Lake Outlet Regional Trail Search Corridor. Those are the regional system components that are within the City of Prior Lake. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is figure 2 from the staff report that identifies the community designation of the city as emerging suburban edge. Prior Lake is located in northern Scott County and is surrounded by the communities of Shakopee, Savage, Credit River Township, and Spring Lake Township, as well as Shakopee, Mdewakanton Sioux Community, or SMSC, land that is within the city. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is table 1 in your staff report that shows that between 2020 and 2040, the council forecasts that the city will grow by 10,100 people, representing 4,200 households, and there will be an increase of 3,100 jobs in the city in the same time frame. As mentioned in the staff report, the city does not have land use authority on the areas that are under SMSC control. Based on an agreement in 2016 between the Metropolitan Council and the City of Prior Lake and SMSC, the council treats SMSC as a separate community, and SMSC related forecasts were excluded from the forecasts that are shown in this table. And just to give you a bit more background on that, the council amended the local forecast and allocation of affordable housing need for both cities of Prior Lake and Shakopee based on that agreement. Shakopee's plan has already been authorized by the council in August of 2019. That forecast amendment was then to take into account the tribal holdings and the resulting planning impacts for both Prior Lake and Shakopee. SMSC is a sovereign nation and is not subject to comply with the local planning, the Land Planning Act requirements. And both council members, Barber and Wolf, as well as several council staff, were involved in discussions with the city and tribal government for that conversation back in 2016. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is table 2 from the staff report and shows a planned density for the city. The overall density for guided residential land in the city of Prior Lake is expected to be between 3.24 and 5.74 units per acre. Communities that have an emerging suburban edge designation are expected to plan for forecasted population and households at a minimum densities of, let me back up, average minimum densities of 3 to 5 units per acre, which the Prior Lakes plan is consistent with. Next slide, please. The city's existing land use map that's before you is figure 3 of the staff report. The existing land uses are predominantly residential, agricultural, and then open water. And about 6% of the city is undeveloped, and about 9% of the land within the city limits is owned and controlled or controlled by SMSC. And that's what's shown in gray on this map. Next slide, please. This is figure 4 of the staff report, which is the city's future land use map. The future land uses remain, as you can see, mostly residential. In the future land use, that represents over 78% of the land, followed by planned industrial land. The majority of the higher density residential is concentrated in the downtown area that has a little border around it just for representation. And on the northern parts of the city that's closer to the city of Shakopee. Next slide, please. So the proposed findings are that the plan conforms to Metropolitan System plans, is consistent with council policies, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent local governmental units and affected jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on Tuesday, May 12th, the plan was included on the consent agenda for the Environment Committee, and it will be on the Metropolitan Council's agenda at the May 27th meeting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the proposed action before you today is to authorize the City of Prior Lake to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, advise the city that prior to final plan adoption, the plan should be revised to include the TAZ information that was included in supplemental information submitted to Council on February 5th of 2020, and to implement the advisory comments in the review record for transportation and land use. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Smiley. And I'm back on my headset. Thanks for the guidance, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Yeah. So any questions on that report? Any questions? I'm not seeing any. If not, Ms. Smiley has recommended an action, and I would entertain a motion to approve, please.
Moves approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Johnson seconds.
Thank you. Discussion on that motion? Any discussion? Seeing none, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes. Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Lilligren, Lilligren.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That motion carries. Wow, bumpy start to the meeting. And I would ask, my bad. And I would ask my committee members' indulgence. There's sort of a disclaimer that I was asked to read at the beginning of committee meetings. You've all heard it a million times, but I think for the record and for the benefit of the public, I'll ask you indulgence. I'm just going to read it really quickly right now. We're conducting this meeting by electronic means as permitted by the open meeting law because of extraordinary circumstances. This meeting will be conducted by WebEx and will be recorded. Members of the public will be able to monitor the meeting by calling the number on the agenda and using the passcode on the agenda, or by clicking the link on the agenda to view the live stream of the meeting. That number and passcode are also listed on the agenda. We know the guidelines. Please only use the written chat function to address technical difficulties. And when you make a motion, second a motion, please state your name. You guys are doing that. All votes must be taken by roll call. And during the course of the meeting, if you leave the location, please inform me of your absence at the time so we can ensure quorum continues. Cool, thank you. Now back to business. You think I'd get better at this as time went on, but okay. Now business item 2020-146. It's the City of Eagan, Gallery of Eagan Comprehensive Plan Amendment, and it will be presented by Patrick Boylan. Mr. Boylan, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Patrick, and I'm the sector representative and local planning assistance for districts 13, 14, 15, and 16. This afternoon, I'll be presenting my staff report on the Gallery of Eagan Amendment site in District 15. Eagan City planning staff, Ms. Sarah Thomas, is attending this WebEx event. At least I think she is. And just a quick public acknowledgement of her work with me on this amendment, and general her hard work in responding me to during the analysis phase of this amendment. I just wanted to thank her very much. Next slide, please. As shown as figure 1 of the staff report, the city is designated as suburban as according to the community designations found and detailed in Thrive MSC 2040. Eagan is located in north central Dakota County. The area affected by the amendment is shown in red, which you can see is located to the west of Interstate 35E and about 2 miles south of Interstate 494. The aerial image on the right side of your screen shows 2 small office buildings that will be removed for a new multifamily residential project. Next slide, please. As shown in figure 2 of your staff report, this map shows regional systems in relation to the amendment site. Regional systems include the interstate freeways, as mentioned previously, a BRT line, regional parks and trails, and regional sanitary sewer investments. Next slide, please. The amendment proposes to change the land use for a 2.8 acre site from office service to high density residential. The purposes of the amendment is to allow this multifamily residential project with 162 units and increases the maximum density to 57 units per acre. Next slide, please. This image shows, also from staff report, shows the light pink, which is the office service, translating to the brown color, which is high density residential. Next slide, please. Table 1 shows an increase of the household forecast and population of the city of Eagan for the years 2030 and 2040. Because of the amendment, the official Eagan forecast will revise to show that in 2040, the population increased to 74,300 and the 2040 households will increase to 30,850. Employment will remain the same. The city, because of this forecast increase in households, the affordable housing need for the community rises to 527 units for the 2021 to 2030 decade. Next slide, please. Table 1 from the staff report shown here illustrates the planned residential density of the city. With this amendment, the city expects over 308 acres to develop a minimum of 1,644 units. The amendment results in a slight increase in the overall density of the city to 6.6 units per acre. As stated in the staff report, the city meets Thrive's density minimum of 5 units per acre for the suburban community designation. Next slide, please. Staff report finds that the proposed amendment conforms to Metropolitan system plans, is consistent with council policies, is compatible with the plans of adjacent local governmental units and affected jurisdictions. Next, please. And the proposed action before you today and then for the council later this month is to authorize the city of Eagan to place its Gallery of Eagan comprehensive plan into effect, revise the city's forecast for population and households upwards as shown in table 1 of the review record, revise the city's affordable housing need to 527 units, and finally to advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record for forecasts and natural resources. Next slide, please. That concludes my report, Chair Lilligren. I'm available for any questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that report and for your work on this. And I also didn't catch the name of the Egan planner that was on the call, but there is one sort of unidentified person.
Yep, that is Sarah Thomas. I don't know if that identified person is her or not.
No, I see her now, Sarah Thomas. Thanks for your work on this, Ms. Thomas, and thanks for being here tonight. Any questions on that report? Questions? Seeing none, Mr. Boylan has proposed a series of actions relative to this plan amendment, and I'd entertain a motion to approve.
Wolf moves approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Coming second.
Thank you, council members. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion? Seeing none, Michelle, please call the roll on the motion.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf,
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That motion carries. And we have concluded our business items. We're going to move on to our information items. And committee members, if you're interested, I've also asked Director Barajas if she would just give a brief verbal status report on the status of the camp at Hiawatha Avenue and 28th. That is on Met Council right-of-way. And Director Barajas and her team have been very busy putting a plan together for the approach to the camp. And so if committee members are interested, Director Barajas is prepared to do that at the end of our agenda. So we will move on to information items. The first is a 2020 Housing Performance Score update, and that'll be presented by Hillary Lovelace. Welcome, Ms. Lovelace.
Thank you so much, Chair. In this presentation, I'm going to go over what the Housing Performance Score is, why we use it, the outreach that we've done to come up with the updates to scoring criteria for the next 2 years. At the end, I'm going to ask you some questions about specific scoring criteria, but what I most want your feedback on is what you see as the future of the Housing Performance Score. If we were all together in a physical place, this is where I would ask for a show of hands about who feels confident about that they know what the Housing Performance Score is. I know that this item was brought to you in the Fund Distribution Plan update for the Limited Communities Act programs, but we're going to go through a kind of quick reminder. The biennial update to the criteria used in the Housing Performance Score is something that the Council committed to doing in the Housing Policy Plan, which was adopted in late 2014. This will be the third time that we've updated the scoring criteria of the Housing Performance Score. Next slide, please. So the Housing Performance Score is the best way to do two things that we're required to do by statute. The first being an affordable housing production report, and the second being asking about affordable and life cycle housing opportunity amount. So we usually refer to the affordable and life cycle housing opportunity amount by its kind of shortened nickname, ALHOA. And ALHOA is required by each community that participates in LCA. So two of the ways that the Housing Performance Score has been used is currently it is used as part of the 2020 Regional Solicitation for Transportation Funding. And historically, it has been used in LCA scoring, but that was discontinued as of the 2020 LCA Fund Distribution Plan. The Housing Performance Score is also one of the ways that we learn about what's going on in the communities across the region. It helps us know how many communities have adopted a local accessory dwelling unit policy. It lets us know how many communities are considering adopting a local 4D policy. This helps us gauge our efforts in planning assistance to communities across the region. And it also helps us identify roadblocks. Sometimes communities, when they're doing their Housing Performance Score, recognize that a project has been slowed down or efforts of theirs could be improved by speaking with council staff. It also is one of the ways that we learn about some of the really remarkable things that communities are doing as it relates to housing. And we can hold up those as kind of examples and opportunities for celebration. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, there are just two things required in statute that we use the housing performance score to do. The housing performance score itself is not required in statute. It's just the vehicle that we use to get both of these things done. So the first is the Affordable Housing Production Report, and the second is the Affordable and Life Cycle Housing Opportunities amount. Next slide, please. So in the update of criteria for the housing performance score, we did two separate outreach efforts. The first was, as we received all of the housing performance scores returned in late 2019, I sent a follow-up survey to communities. It's just about 8 questions long, asking them basic facts about the survey. Do you think that the survey is appropriate in scope and scale? And to follow that up, we created a work group in March that went over kind of the following goals. It looked at the metrics that are measured in the housing performance score, how the housing performance score is collected, and how each thing is valued. The work group that we held in March included communities from every county in our 7-county region. It included representatives from a few county staff. We always work with county staff to pre-populate as much information in the housing performance score to reduce the burden on communities as they answer questions in the housing performance score. So counties are one of our large partners in this effort. We invited metro cities, some housing advocate groups, including the Housing Justice Center, and developers, including Common Bond, that does affordable housing development in our region. So information in these slides that you're seeing right now was sent out to this work group for final comments today. Next slide, please. So here's a sample of some of the responses that we got from the follow-up survey from communities that returned their housing performance score. We did not ask for identifying information for communities when they returned this survey, but I did try and make an effort to invite communities to the work group that I didn't think had answered the survey. So this shows that there aren't any strong feelings one way or another among respondents about if the community score is determined by factors within their effort at control, but that 4 out of 10 disagreed. 1 indicated that they do not reply to the housing performance score because they don't have enough information, and others, agreed and were sort of neutral on this. Next slide, please. Back 1 slide. I think we just skipped one. Thank you. So in further responses to the follow-up survey in late 2019, we asked them if they prefer that future housing performance score surveys include more detail, less detail, or about the same amount of detail. And in the wording of this question, I tried to balance that more detail means that the score is a little bit harder for some communities to answer, while less detail makes it easier and less burdensome for other communities to complete. Not all communities that responded to the survey answered this question, only 7 responses. But there were a few that asked to consider lowering the amount of detail so that things are easier to complete. Next slide, please. When I met with the Housing Performance Score work group in early March, I showed them this spectrum of how to think about the housing performance score, ranging from simple, where there's a picture of somebody writing on the back of an envelope, to just right with Goldilocks and the 3 bears, to complicated with the picture of the matrix man. I indicated that I think that we currently live in the complicated matrix zone of the housing performance score. The housing performance score has 4 areas. It scores on new construction, preservation and rehab, housing programs and policies, which includes whether or not a community has met their ALHOA, and existing housing stock. Next slide, please. And when I showed these proposed scenarios with a little bit more detail after our first discussion, the work group sort of chose to stay in the complicated lane. They only wanted minor updates to what we've been doing for the past 2 years with a few tweaks. So making sure that we collect more information about 50 to 60 area median income class of new units that are created, a switch from total development cost to ALHOA, and asking about age restriction in new developments, affordable or not, and some new policies and responding to changes in affordable housing production, including income averaging. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit more of what we heard from the work group. What we heard from the work group is in the main bullet point, and what our response as council staff was in the green kind of dash beneath each bullet point. So what we heard, and honestly, we're a little surprised to hear, is that community staff find this a useful exercise and a useful use of our council staff time to help them continue doing. There's a strong request to keep auto calculation and as much pre-population from outside sources in the housing performance score, and that's something we're committed to continuing to do. They wanted us to keep measures that allow communities to score well and continue to award efforts that go unfunded. What they're referring to here is that often communities work to fund an affordable housing development, but they don't receive the funding either from the state or other outside sources to make it happen. We, for the past, I think, 4 to 6 years, have always awarded partial points to communities that report on these efforts, where they have council support to do a development, but the funding hasn't reached it yet to break ground. So we'll continue to do that. We of course want to honor the work of communities. We know that it often takes several funding cycles for affordable housing development to break ground. One thing that came up that was kind of a new consideration is to consider hostility to affordable housing and efforts to combat it. A lot of communities, I think, previously didn't understand that any of their efforts to further opportunities for affordable and life cycle housing count towards their ALHOA. So we want to make clearer in the survey in the future that in community engagement or staff time to make affordable housing developments happen definitely count towards their ALHOA. Next slide, please. Other things that we heard are making sure that we consider the capacity of each city, helping the most vulnerable, and looking at sort of a couple of different specific issues, like whether or not minority businesses have some sort of preference in a community. These all, for the large part, have already been contained in the housing performance score, and people were reiterating the value of this. They also asked that we switch from counting the number of shelters or transitional homes to the number of units within all of these shelters and transitional homes. Currently, we were operating on the number of facilities rather than the number of beds, because that's what the Minnesota Department of Health reports. But we recognize that the number of beds makes more sense as a value to calculate than just the number of facilities, because a community could have many facilities with a very small number of beds, and instead of the reverse, a lot of beds in just one facility. So we're going to try and find a way to get that information and make the score a little bit fairer. They want us to keep auto calculation and pre-population, which we will of course do. And then there were communities that were concerned about the loss of carrots for elected bodies and decision makers in the fact that the housing performance score isn't considered for LCA funding award criteria. And we brainstormed as a work group a couple of different ways to continue making good behavior a celebrated thing. So we're considering something like an award for most improve, or highlights of great examples in the local planning handbook online on the council website, or other ways to honor the efforts and successes of communities across the region when it comes to creating affordable housing. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go into sort of the next area of this presentation, which is the proposed scoring changes to the housing performance score. There are 3 main areas that are going through proposed changes, and we're going to spend about 1 slide on each of these changes to talk about them in detail. But before we get there, I just wanted to note that there are a couple of other small changes that we're making to the survey that I tested and don't really create meaningful scoring accounts, but are things that we're collecting for our own data and consideration including whether or not facilities have an age restriction for just seniors, and shifting from shelter beds to from number of facilities. Next slide, please. So the first scoring change is the largest one. Currently, there's a whole quarter of the housing performance score, which is dedicated to existing housing stock below 80% AMI. This is just the number of units that we calculate from the American Community Survey, the census, and a few other sources that exist in each community. So we don't know if those affordable housing opportunities are inhabited by people with low incomes. We don't know if they're helping meet the needs of that community. This is just the amount of housing stock. So we would like to shift away from awarding communities for housing stock that exists in the housing performance score. I think that this made a lot more sense as a scoring criteria when it was more directly tied to funding opportunities, as some communities have a large proportion of affordable housing due to the era in which the housing was constructed, and communities felt very strongly that this should be considered as part of their availability for funding competitiveness, as other factors considered in their score have to do with new construction and rehab. However, with the score no longer being considered for council funding and a paradigm shift towards the individual value of a project proposal rather than the community's worthiness of funding in general, I think that it makes sense here to stick to the intent of the statute. Is the community using levied funds to further affordable and life cycle housing opportunities? So staff interpretation of what fits in an affordable and life cycle housing opportunity is broad. It can range from staff time spent on station area planning that includes affordable housing to operating a housing improvement area in order to help an aging condo association upgrade elevator systems, but keep low-income families in those homes. So this shows that the number of points allocated to the existing housing stock would shift partly into shelters and permanent housing for vulnerable populations, but mostly into ALHOA. So one of the things that I'm thinking about here is whether or not ALHOA should be able to spill over into other housing programs, accounting for about half of the score, or if we should award even more points for ALHOA if communities are spending above the value that is calculated for them. Right now, we award communities a certain number of points for meeting the statutory guideline, 85% of their ALHOA, and slightly more points for meeting 100% of their ALHOA, but nothing for above that. So we'll come back to that question at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Our second proposed scoring criteria is a little wonky. So either stay with me or just tune out if, if this starts to get a little dense. So currently, the direct financial contributions to affordable housing by a community or for preservation and rehab is awarded as a portion of their total development cost. So the whole cost of the specific project is used as sort of the denominator for the community contribution. I think that this was actually a pretty clever scoring criteria, right? They're looking at how much the community has put into the total cost of the development. But the problem in practice has been that communities often don't know the total cost of the development. They know for sure how much money they put into the project, but they often don't ask the developer for information about exactly how much it took the project to compose. And often communities are not looking for a couple of extra points here and there, and so they leave it blank. The impact of this is that communities with lower resource or who do not have the staff time to call their county and figure out exactly how much a development cost are getting lower scores than communities that are more high resource and have some dedicated housing staff. So my proposal is to switch the denominator from total development cost to a value that we can pre-populate and always know, which is ALHOA. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the last of the large proposed scoring changes is just an update to the housing policies that we include in the survey. Each housing policy is important, and we try and include a range of housing policies in here that allow each community to show their opportunity to shine and score well. So points are awarded only if the policy has been used in the last few years. There are a lot of communities that have policies on the books that go inactive for one reason or another. So just to make it clear that this is for programs and policies that are being used. So the only policy that we're planning on removing is requiring a locally adopted fair housing policy. This is a requirement of receiving funds through LCA. Many communities across the region, more than 25, have already adopted local fair housing policies. So we're no longer going to award points for that because it's been a criteria for one funding cycle now, and there's been wide adoption. However, we are, in response to comments from the work group, adding 2 new policies. If there is a displacement prevention policy in place for communities that are seeing rapid redevelopment. Obviously, this sounded a little bit different 2 months ago, pre-economic slump due to the virus. And the second one is equity in development and hiring policy. If there's any sort of promotion or proposal that new construction go to minority and women-owned businesses, that will be something that is considered. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at some of the scoring impacts that each of these changes would have on communities. In most cases, shifting from existing housing stock to ALHOA raises scores. There are a couple of examples of communities that do not raise scores for this. Badness Heights is unique among suburban Ramsey County communities in that they almost every year report their ALHOA spending. Many counties levy for housing within communities, and they spend that money for ALHOA adjacent programs. So Hennepin County, for example, has AHIF, which works towards the construction of new affordable housing. However, Ramsey County does not levy for housing. They are the only county in the 7-county region that does not. And so we cannot pre-populate information for ALHOA for those communities. So if they don't report ALHOA, they don't get it. Whereas previously, if they had existing housing stock, that's not something they have to report, and so they would get those points. So I know one other community, I just was browsing through them earlier today, the city of Mound did not report their ALHOA, and so they would have lost 4 points if everything else stayed the same in the score this year. But I do want to reiterate that ALHOA is a required part for participation in the Livable Communities Act program. On the second one, I think New Germany is an interesting example. They're one of our smaller Livable Communities Act participants. And even though I was thinking of New Germany in all of these changes, there's actually no impact to their score. They never reported a contribution to ALHOA, though it would be higher if we switch to it because they never reported TDC either. Housing policies, by offering more housing policies, perhaps they would check more things. So this shows some of the scores and how they would change. Next slide, please. Last thing I wanted to share to you related to the housing performance score is that we're going through a lot of internal work with our information services staff to bring the housing performance score out of its Excel document survey format to an online survey, which hopefully will increase response rates. One of the things that we're most proud of is showing the score as they change information in the survey. We'll kind of pre-populate in that top corner, kind of like TurboTax, if you guys have ever used that software. I just want to shout out the IS staff have been really amazing through this entire process, and I am incredibly impressed with what they've been able to come with in such a short amount of time. Next slide, please. And so now we're here to the question slide. The first two are follow-up questions that were included on slides earlier in the presentation. Do you think ALHOA should spill over, or should it just be a hard cap at what people can get that doesn't make up for not adopting other policies that are supportive of housing and life cycle housing development? Should there be extra points for going above and beyond the base value of ALHOA? Are there any policies missing in the list that we looked over earlier that communities should be thinking about and considering? And what do you see as the future of the housing performance score? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lovelace, for that report and for all your work on this. Very informative. And so we'll dive into those questions. First, we have a question from Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you. I guess I can first start out by talking about what I think in general about the future of the housing performance scores. That is a question to all of us. I certainly love to see continuous improvement in how we address issues with housing, lack of affordability, livable communities, etc. I like to look at how we are using our scoring to address limitations in financial resources. And you addressed limitations with cities in terms of staff size, which was great. And I'd like to see an increase or weight on cities that are doing the best at creating opportunities where opportunities don't currently exist. I've created scores before, and what helps me, I know on page 15 you have sample scoring impacts, is to be able to put certain values like into a spreadsheet and see how they come out. I'm very visual and hands-on in the way that I process things. So that's very helpful for me versus just kind of looking at a set presentation. And what would maybe be helpful is after this meeting, allow us the opportunities to, play with a few different scenarios. And I'd be interested in discussing that with Ms. Lovelace or someone else if you're interested afterwards.
Thank you, Council Member. Ms. Lovelace, did you want to respond to anything that Councilmember Chambliss said, or should we just go on to the next questions?
I appreciate Councilmember Chambliss's comments. Thank you, Chair. I'm just soaking it in.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Other comments from council members? Councilmember Johnson, then Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gosh, I should go after Councilmember Wolf because she's really good at this stuff. So would it be possible to put up the presentation again? I was taking notes and just writing a few page numbers down. I'll be brief. My first, as brief as possible. My first question is, how many people or how many communities, cities were surveyed? Because in the results, you had mentioned that you had 10 responses and 7 responses for the pie chart graph information we were given. Oh, sorry. Child running through the yard, dog loves that part. Okay, maybe I should not. Stop it. Okay. I just want to, because I'm taking away a lot from this, but it's 7 responses, and I don't know what the percentage of overall respondents were. So I'm going to mute this and listen to your answer and grab my dog.
I have a dog too, I understand. Thank you, Council Member and Chair. This survey was sent out to every community that returned the housing performance score. So more than 80 communities. Only 10 communities responded. Only 7 communities responded to this specific question.
So, Mr. Chair, I think it's good that, thank you for doing that, following up. I guess I feel like, gosh, that's not a lot of responses. Maybe it is very proportionate to the whole, how they would all answer. But, it really, there's a lot of people kind of in different thought categories here. So that makes me wonder, I guess where I'm coming from is some communities have a lot of resources to do this stuff. Other communities don't. Some communities face opportunities differently than others when it comes to affordable housing. So I was just trying to get my head around who these responses were coming from. Maybe like Councilmember Chambliss said, just to gauge, are they big communities, little communities, where are they coming from? So that was just one question. Could we go to slide 12? So my question on this is proposed max score on the existing housing stock below 80%. So that's below 80% of AMI, correct?
Councilmember Chair, yes, that's correct.
Okay, so the question I have on that is based on valuation, because I think I heard you say in the presentation, we don't know who's actually living in these units or what their incomes are on an annual basis. Did I hear you say that correctly?
Councilmember Chair, that is correct.
Okay. And I'm trying to, this was a lot for me to absorb. So this is really great information. But I just had a moment where I thought, you know, and I think it comes up elsewhere in the ALHOA, but you know, even that housing stock, not knowing what the annual household incomes are, I just know that there's a great opportunity, and communities are struggling with housing preservation. So maybe that comes back later in the scores where communities are enacting housing preservation ordinances and they get more points for that. But I know I represent a lot of communities in my district that that's where the biggest challenge lies, is just trying to preserve what they have. Could you turn to slide 13, please? On this one, so just so I'm understanding, when we talk about developments, we're talking about new development, correct?
Councilmember Johnson, Chair Lilligren, yes, also preservation and rehab projects. So both.
Okay, and as they're trying to, so is this all public, a publicly funded development where you could maybe get to your costs more easily, or could this be a nonprofit affordable developer, or could it be just a private developer that's coming in and cobbling all kinds of funding from different sources? I'm just trying to understand, or is it all of the above?
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Johnson, it's all of the above.
Okay.
The only requirement is that it has affordable units that are affordable for 15 years or more.
Okay. And then on this one, I think that there was a note of communities getting some points for their contribution to the developments. Is that a contribution? Do those contributions, I'm certain it cash counts or bonding or whatever they might be doing, or HRA or whatever tools that they have, but could that also be reduced fees? Could it also be timing of the project, getting it through development, through the thorough public process, but sooner rather than later can save costs? Does it involve land trusts? I mean, is it kind of the scope of this local contribution, or is it just cash?
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Johnson, this is a great question. I really appreciate this. Yes, it includes many of those things. Land trusts are scored separately, but everything else that you mentioned is considered in the community contribution. When we say community, what we mean is the local community, the municipality. If there are county contributions, those are counted separately. Thank you.
Okay. And then the only thing I would say about that, and given the situation we're at with the legislature right now, I will zip it. But, a community could be really leaning in and trying to get a project done, and they may have allocated whatever they had on just a previous project, so they're out. And so it kind of, even though they're, really working hard, hopefully some of those other scores will boost them up, because there just is only so much funding, and the well runs dry at the local level pretty fast. So I don't want to penalize those that are really trying to allocate their funds as judiciously as possible. So that's just more of a comment. And then finally, just slide 14, please. So the only thing on this that I wrote was new housing policies, which is great. I'm sure there must be a list of examples and things that fall under as a drop-down menu in this section. Points awarded only if the policy has been used in the past few years. So few years seems vague. I'm not sure what the policies are, although I know there are examples of policies out there. I'm not trying to sound ignorant, but I wonder if there's some specificity so cities know what that means. And I'm sure you work with that all the time. But I also know that in the years that I worked on getting our comp plans through and making sure all of our tools, housing tools were listed and getting everything in order so that that tool belt was ready to go with whatever opportunities came our way. But there were just times where we just, couldn't use the policy or the tool for whatever reason, even though we had it ready. And so I want to be a little bit careful because I don't want there to be a negative consequence. Like, well, if you're not using your policy in the past few years, you won't get points. I think there's still some great validity in cities just having them ready to go, whether they could or couldn't use them, because I'll just stop there. So those were my comments. You can tell I'm very passionate. And I think this is a lot of great information. I really appreciate staff working on this.
Thank you,
So that's a lot
Councilmember
of
Johnson.
questions.
And I know in your first set of questions, you were talking about who actually responded to the survey. And the 70, were you hoping that Ms. Lovelace could tell us more about that now? Great.
Well, Mr. Chair, it doesn't have to be now. I want to be respectful to other people, but I think like Councilmember Chambliss, like who responded, and then maybe who responded after the first survey, just to get an understanding of who across the region was helping to get this information back to us. And then always, well, who didn't respond and why? We don't know, but it'd be nice to know.
Okay. So as follow-up. Cool. Sounds good. Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Councilmember Johnson. 10 out of the region for responses is a really, really poor response rate to a survey. So I can't really learn anything from that survey unless we get more communities to respond, or we know which communities did respond so that we get an idea of what the slant is from where that information is coming from, because there just aren't enough responses to get a good region-wide feel of what people are thinking. A lot of my other thoughts are related to slide 14 with the policies. A lot of those are very Minneapolis and St. Paul centric policies, because like the inclusionary housing policy, if you live out in the burbs and you're having a hard time getting market rate rental apartments to even be built, adding an inclusionary housing policy would just destroy any chance of ever having anything high density built in your community. There are very different forces at play in terms of the market in high demand areas versus farther out. And I don't think that scoring for that really recognizes that. And also with the displacement prevention policy, it's the same kind of deal. In the burbs, if you're building affordable housing, you're either doing it on green space or you're doing it on a dead strip mall somewhere. You're not displacing people who are already in a building. So having a displacement prevention policy when you never displace anybody doesn't really accomplish anything. So we'd give more points to Minneapolis and St. Paul, but the other areas wouldn't be ever eligible for those points, because they'd either have to make a policy that doesn't accomplish anything, or they're not getting points for something that would never happen anyway. And also with the equity and development and hiring policy, in Dakota County anyway, most of the affordable housing that is constructed, the entire building is affordable, and it's constructed by the county. They're now partnering with some other, Aon and the different affordable housing groups, but most of the time the county has been the developer. So a city having a policy to tell the county how they're supposed to run their business is not something that cities would really want to do. I mean, they're great partners with the county in getting things done, but those sorts of extra policies are they're more like what Hennepin County does, where each city has to reinvent the wheel rather than the partnership aspect that's done in some of the other counties. So I'm a little concerned about adding some more policies that are basically metrocentric rather than looking at the whole region. The other thing is the points awarded only if the policy has been used in the past few years is detrimental to small communities because they'll have one development and then they'll go several years without having another development because they're so small. And I mean, Dakota County has the same population as Minneapolis, but you don't get points for everything that happens in Dakota County if you're a city in Dakota County. So those sorts of metrics are inherently biased towards larger communities and don't recognize the unique situation that smaller communities are in. They may be doing a lot of affordable housing relative to the size of the community, but it doesn't happen that often because if you build a 100-unit building in a community that only has 600 people, that's a major development. But then you go for a while before it happens again because you're just a small community and not very much development is happening. Whereas if you're Minneapolis or St. Paul, you're having those all of the time and inherently able to get more points. So I think having a way to balance out points where small communities are not penalized for being small is important.
Thank you, Councilmember. I would note that at 4:54, Councilmember Lee private messaged me and said that he had to leave. He apologizes. And I have in queue Councilmembers Atlas Ingerbritsen and Councilmember Chambliss. So Councilmember Atlas Ingerbritsen.
Thanks, Chair. I've been waiting for this conversation since December 2nd of I was almost saying 1999, which was not the case, but is my default year I've found in my brain. But December 2nd, 2019, when we were talking about projects and staff person, Lisa Barajas, director, told me we'd have an opportunity to look at this rubric year to come. And so I'm excited for the conversation and thank the staff for all the work on this. I have a couple observations looking back from my notes from that time. I think it, and maybe just to add another affirmational support for ideas mentioned before. I love the idea of seeing scenarios for comparison in some of the ways that council members have talked about already, urban, rural, and suburban communities. I also would like to see, just in order to really know how this would play out. I also have to agree that the participation in the survey is not enough to present the data in a way that it tells that it actually is telling a story we can rely on being represented. And I think, sometimes we think the method isn't to me as important as the information in this context. And so what I'm wondering is, can we just call folks and say, hey, can we have 10 minutes of your time to interview them on this important topic and collect the information that way instead of asking people to do a survey, which they may not complete, but even if we got 10 more people to respond, that would be significant, but I think it's really important to have that information. My notes going back to December were around how are we tracking other types of information? Like, are there places where fathers are welcome? Was one of the things looking back towards young people, people with disabilities, so that type of beds. The other part is around the intent of looking at the ALHOA goals is really around helping us meet the Met Council policies. And our equity lens in Thrive seems to be really maybe missing here, and what's the spirit of the changes? How are we accomplishing our Thrive directives and policy? So I'm wondering if we could, take those steps to get some side-by-side case study or scenarios to show that the suggested changes have the intended impact. And also, would it be possible to really be explicit about how our equity lens and priorities are showing up in a way that's thoughtful for each of the different types of communities, whether they're rural, suburban, or urban. And can we make sure we're taking this opportunity to provide us with demographic information on projects that allow us to make sure we're accomplishing the goals of the council, and also able to identify any trends that might be creating desperate impacts for communities and furthering inequities.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I'm assuming, Councilman Ratlinger, and those weren't just rhetorical questions, or at least some of them. Those are the things you would like to hear from Ms. Lovelace now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I anticipate that not being something we could hear right now. I anticipate
Okay.
those being things that would
We're teeing up for
take
future
time. But
comments.
yes, those three things are things that I would like to co-sign on from other council members and then ask.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Moving through the queue, Councilmember Chambliss.
Thanks. Yeah, I think as far as looking at the scoring changes on page 14 and 15, and what I heard from Councilmember Linnea and Councilmember Wolf, somehow quantifying that information when we're looking at modifying the denominator in the score calculation. It would be nice to maybe see what are the data points that would be used as an example to come up with that calculation. And if you had different scores, what does it look like? So that's what I meant when I was saying that I'd like to be able to, be hands-on and put in some different scenarios. And then what I heard Linnea say was, Councilmember Linnea, she spoke and used the keyword impact. And as we would put in those data points, we would have an idea based on ALHOA of what we would want the end result to be based on putting in those data points, whether it be the new housing policies or, how recent the points were awarded, whether or not it's single family homes or, high density, those based on what we want the results to be. Before we sign off on, yeah, we want to change the scoring, I think I would like to see a little bit more on what the values would be. And then also just going back to not only the impact on affordability and livability, but on page 9, there was a statement about allowing all communities to score well. Well, if we're doing that, are we really going to achieve equity? So that's why I think, just being very goal focused on what we are trying to accomplish in terms of livability and equity. And what does that mean in terms of small communities? What does it mean in terms of the impact that we want after we finish changing the scoring?
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion? Questions? Comments? Ms. Beard has asked to address some of the comments. So if no other council members are wanting to speak right now, I will recognize Ms. Beard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and Hillary for your work on this. I just want to, given that Hillary's been with us at the council for about 2 years, and this is her kind of second rodeo with the scores. And I've had the benefit of being here through the original housing policy plan and the complete upheaval of the score system. Then I was hoping I could take a few minutes to offer a little bit of perspective and address some of the comments. I want to point out that housing performance scores do consider
new construction of affordable housing and preservation of affordable housing for more than the year in which that is done. And that is one of the big changes that came out of the housing policy plan, upheaval of the scoring, to make sure that communities that don't see a lot of development are still able to count new construction of development for many years to come. We also factor into the scores how much affordable housing development is created as in comparison to how much housing overall has been created, so that we are making sure, so that we're actually looking at factors such as, you know, if you built 10 affordable units that year, of 12 units built, that's very different than 10 affordable units that year, or really in the past 10 years for new construction out of 10,000 housing units. So I guess I just want to reassure folks that the housing performance score is incredible. It does look like the man in the matrix. It's an incredibly complex set of calculations and spreadsheets that take this very helpful policy guidance and put them into, you know, math equations for as best as we can with our research partners, amongst ourselves, and it is really complicated. But I think that the policy direction is incredibly helpful for staff, but a lot of what's getting brought up is in the weeds, but we just tend to bring to you more of the higher level policy considerations. So, you know, I will just reiterate that these are really great points and just show how complicated it can get. We were surprised to hear that communities wanted us to keep scoring with an actual numeric value, since we aren't using that numeric value in any meaningful way, you know, anymore. So I think it's one of those things where people are kind of not sure what the value of something is, but they're kind of not quite comfortable with changing it too much either. And there's been a very slow progression of really changing what the scores mean to us, to communities, how we measure them over the years. But I think people can only handle so much change at a time. So it's looked like a little bit each year. I guess I'll stop there. But if there's any further questions that I can provide from those from that longer perspective, I'm happy to answer them.
Yep, thank you, Ms. Beard. Councilmember Johnson's requesting to speak. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you so much, Ms. Beard. I really appreciate it. And you are, you know, you're just really an expert on this. And I appreciate the fact that we've got you helping lead and guide us through all of this. You know, and it is in the weeds, but that's where all of this happens. It's in the weeds. Every development that comes forward has its own unique characteristics, its own nuances, its own set of challenges. What does the city have? High authority in guiding and zoning, or are they down to a conditional use permit or a variance with little authority? Is it welcomed by the community or not? The communities I represent, by and large, are fast growing communities. And as we know, land is very expensive. And so we have a housing shortage. We have, since the Great Recession, we never rebounded back from that. And so, you know, to say, you know, if a higher percentage of the affordable units match the overall, or are closer to the number of overall units being produced, I mean, that's great. But I mean, it's next to impossible in some of these communities where there's just not enough funding to do a large percentage of affordability in the new developments that are rolling in, simply because they're still developing up the 94 corridor in my part of the region, and in other parts as well, where when you compare that to a first or second tier suburb that's fully developed, you know, they might not have new construction coming in at any great clip, but they are working at redeveloping, and those numbers could be higher. So I think everything has to be taken into context. I know you know this, but I think maybe to some degree that's where the faster growing communities, when you can't get the resources from all the funding sources you need, including the state and federal government, you know, they're not going to tell market rate homes that they can't come in, hoping that they can get affordability in. And the developer community wants to build affordable units too. It really, there was a big stalemate at the legislature yesterday because of all of the preemption language that was in on a bill from developing developers. But I'm just here to say I get a little nervous because I know the goodwill and the work is out there. People are wanting to do it, but the hurdles are so high. So I don't want there to be things baked in that kind of cut people off at the pass at the community level, because it's just incredibly difficult to do it.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and with going through all of this economic change with the COVID business, we don't know what's going to happen with the viability of tax credits in the next several years. We saw in the previous recession that tax credits weren't worth anything because businesses weren't making any money. So they didn't need to buy any tax credits, which makes it very challenging for doing affordable housing developments. That may happen again. And I just want to echo what Councilmember Johnson is saying. I had a presentation from the city of Lakeville a couple weeks ago, and their development pace is ahead of last year in spite of everything that's going on. But if the funding disappears for affordable housing, they may not be able to meet their numbers where, nobody is saying that people who have money can't build a house. But if the tax credits go away, we may see communities really struggling to make their affordable housing when there isn't funding available. And I'm really concerned that that's going to happen soon with everything that's going on with the economy.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thanks, Chair. I guess I kind of am interested in hearing from Ms. Baird what the meant by in the weeds. The reason why I say that is because when we were having this conversation in December, we were told, council members, hold on to your great questions because this is coming back to you and you can give feedback on the rubric. So that's a bit of a mixed message. I just want to make sure I have the right understanding of where we should be providing input or not.
Ms. Beard?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Alice Ingebrigtsen, thank you so much for the follow-up question so I could clarify. My recollection of the conversation where we talked about getting in the weeds and the scoring rubrics is very specific to the fund distribution plan and the scoring criteria we use for awarding Livable Communities Act grants and awards. There really is no rubric for the housing performance scores. They really were created as a back in the 90s as kind of a back of the envelope math that gave numbers to communities that could help their scoring in LCA fund awards or not, it gave them some competitive advantage in the LCA awards. And we've come a long way from that in terms of using them that way and thinking of them that way, to Hillary's point earlier, in that evaluating the quality of a project for LCA is not necessarily tantamount to how well that city's been doing to create affordable housing. If anything, we don't want to not fund affordable housing because it's a community that struggled to do so. So there really is no rubric here. It's not, it's called a score because that's kind of how it was originally created, but it's really evolved since then. And it's more of a data collection and kind of touch point in how our community's doing. And like I said, I was surprised communities wanted to keep it on a numeric scale. We were interested in maybe going to a, status quo, doing great, or needs improvement kind of, yellow, green, red kind of thing, to just give communities a very general benchmark of, we're not trying everything we could, or, we're doing okay, but we could be really innovative too. We're rock stars and we're using every tool at our disposal. I'm still hopeful that, frankly, that's the evolution that the scores take over time. But there, in terms of sort of a numeric rubric, scoring criteria influencing, this is not the place where that happens. So when I was getting at in the weeds, I apologize if that came across as disrespectful. I meant how incredibly complex and challenging the spreadsheets are for factoring in the equations that come to these calculations. And I don't talk about it well because it's that ridiculously complicated. And that makes so much room for error. If one cell gets kind of entered incorrectly, the other cell impacts everything else. And because we are tracking development, preservation policies over the last 10 years, it gets even easier to make mistakes every year. And so the online tool is going to help with that. But that's what I was getting at with the in the weeds comment. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks. I'm always a fan of Chair, if I could, asking for clarifying questions before making assumptions. So I appreciate that, Ms. Beard. And I guess one thing I'd like to put out there is just a reminder to colleagues, if they need one, I don't know, but we also hear a lot from community grassroots organizations around the need to advocate for the spirit of affordable housing, and those are stakeholders as well. So I look forward to hearing more and talking more about this, but I want to just make sure that awareness is had, that there is an expectation that as council members we are affecting change and representing communities and all of our communities, not just the electeds or developers or nonprofits, but all of them. And that's a tricky thing to do. And I'm just trying to balance the knowledge that we need, making sure we have the information we need to do that well.
Thank you, Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you. You know, man, I could probably study and we could talk, you know, for hours about this, but I'm hearing on the one hand, you know, how complex, you know, the calculations are, and wouldn't it be easier if we had good, better, best, or you know, that's not what you said, but you know, something that's more simple. What are we being asked? What is in our control to make it better if we already know that, you know, things are so complex that by the time we get to a number, is it really what we want? You know, if it's really complex and the end result is really what we want, to have more affordable, livable communities, then I would say that all that effort is worth it. But if we're not getting the impact out of doing all of those complex calculations, you know, maybe we need to make it less complex. You know, maybe there needs to be 10 data points instead of 50 data points, and how do we do that? Where can we go from here in terms of our barriers and our obstacles from decision making, our barriers and obstacles for communities that need more opportunities for livable communities?
Thank you, Councilmember. And Councilmember Travis, is that, you're putting that out there sort of as a discussion point, right? Or were you looking for a response from staff on that question, or you're putting that position out there? Is this effort worth it? Or were you looking for a response from staff, Councilmember Chambliss?
I would like for them, I mean, I'd like to know more about, you know, what we should be leaving this conversation with. I mean, are we just saying, yeah, we're going to try to make it better, you know, just a little bit over time? But it seems to be a lot more complex than that. And how are we going to be having a big impact if we're just, you know, doing a little bit at a time and we're not even really sure where we're going with it? I mean, we know where we're going with it, but I just want to be able to say, okay, we moved from this point to this point, from 2019 to 2022, and we can measure that and monitor that and show that we're making improvements. I'm not feeling it. Maybe I'm not getting it. I don't know.
Cool. Thank you, Councilwoman. I see Councilmember Benton wants to speak, but I guess I would just offer, I don't know if that'd be Ms. Beard, Ms. Loveless, the sort of where are we going from here question that Councilmember Chambliss is asking.
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Chambliss, thank you. I really appreciate your comment, Councilmember Chambliss. That is what I'm asking. I heard previously this score has been used in consideration for funding criteria. Now it is waning in that use. So I appreciate your comments. How are we using the score to further our goals, to meet ideals that we have in Thrive? I think that that's something that we'll need to keep in mind and in context. I guess what I'm asking the council for feedback on is, do you see this as a useful metric? Does it need to stay as a 1 to 100 score? Is the information that we gather really the point of the housing performance score effort, or is it judging each community against another? Thank you for your comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So I have Councilmember Vento and Councilmember Johnson in queue. Councilmember Vento.
Well, I want to begin by thanking both the staff and the committee members, Mr. Chair. I have learned a lot during both the presentation and this discussion, and I really appreciate it. And I have a question, but I'm not sure how to articulate it in a way that it makes sense. But as a former elementary teacher, I taught during a shift toward working more on individual goals rather than comparing students, and trying to help every student feel as though they were achieving. So kind of with that in mind, I'm wondering if there's a way for us to consider, or if there's any reason for us to consider kind of a bifurcated scoring system where if I'm an outer ring suburb, I am assessing different categories than I might be if I'm an urban setting or an inner ring suburb. I don't know if that's something that has ever been considered, if we have ever done that, or if other cities or regions have ever done that, but just a thought.
Thank you, Councilmember. I also have in queue now Councilmembers Johnson and Wolf. So Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, we had about 80 communities fill out the survey. We had 10 and 7 do the next level of feedback. And I'm sorry, I should know this, but how many communities could have filled out the survey?
Ms. Lovelace or?
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Johnson, about 80 communities responded to the Housing Performance Score survey this year. I do want to note that the responses to the survey were completely optional for communities, and the people who received this were the same folks that responded to the Housing Performance Score, which are often frontline staff that have a lot of competing interests for their time. This wasn't sent to their elected bodies or their city manager. And also that the survey was, completely optional. The work group was a more concerted effort and on our outreach for this effort. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, I know there were 80 that responded. My initial question was how many could have responded?
Councilmember Johnson, I'm sorry.
How many get the invite to do this first layer with the expert staff, of course?
Apologies, Councilmember Johnson. I think I misspoke. 80 communities had the opportunity to respond. 10 communities did respond.
Okay, so 80 communities in the entire metro region had the opportunity, in the 7-county metropolitan region, had the opportunity to respond.
This past cycle, every community in the 7-county region, including townships, was sent the Housing Performance Score.
And how many was that?
About 80 communities of all of the communities in the metro returned the Housing Performance Score completed, or at some level of complete. 10 communities that returned their completed score were given the follow-up survey to answer questions about the Housing Performance Score generally.
Okay, so in the entire metro area, 80 communities were invited to take the survey.
In the entire metro area in 2019, every community and township, more than 80, so what is that? Nearly 200 communities were sent a Housing Performance Score to respond, and 80 responded.
That was my initial question. So thank you. That was the number I was looking for. So we start with over 200, we got 80, and then again, we were down to 10 and 7. I'm just trying to get kind of that global, how we're driving our data. So, because we're trying to, give you guidance, and I'm just trying to get to, how many overall are responding as a percentage, or kind of, that's all I needed to know. So thank you.
We don't hear you anymore, Mr. Chair, but
My apologies, I was muted. Councilmember Wolf.
I can read
you.
your lips, and I knew you said
Very
Councilmember Wolf.
good.
Thank you. And I have no opposition to making this more simple. We went through this exercise in environmental services a couple of years ago where SAC determinations were incredibly complex. They were the most complex in the nation, but they were also the fairest. And we found a way to simplify things pretty significantly and still be fair. I have the same attitude towards housing performance scores. I'm not a big fan of using them for our other funding decisions, but then I represent all communities that are working in partnership with the Dakota County CDA to do whatever affordable housing developments are available. I hear about places that just say, no, we don't want that, but I don't represent any of those places. So for me, it's not a big issue. But if we can make it simpler so that more places fill out the stuff, great. There's a lot of townships that have no staff or one or two staff. I mean, I have even small cities where one of the council members runs the wastewater treatment plant. So, you know, there's a lot of differences in communities, and some of my communities are never going to put in for a TAB grant or a livable communities grant because that's just not their wheelhouse. The county does things for them. So I maybe have a different opinion than other council members, but if we can make things simpler, I'm all fine with making things simpler.
Thank you, Council Member. Not seeing any other council members requesting queue. Councilmember Chambliss has asked if Ms. Lovelace would like to share some thoughts with the rest of the committee. I think there's some communication that may have been not public, that was made public, but I would like to give you this opportunity, Ms. Lovelace, if there's something that you think we should know.
Thank you, Chair Lilligren. Just one other comment that earlier Councilmember Wolf mentioned that partnership with the county isn't considered in the housing performance score. I think that that's something we could include. I think that close partnership with other levels of government to achieve affordable housing outcomes could be a policy that we include in that list. So I just welcome all of you to continue to think of specific ways that you'd like to make your imprint on the housing performance score and share that with me. And I apologize for my comment in the chat that was not meant to go to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Understood. Thank you, Ms. Lovelace. Councilmember Wolf.
I didn't say that close partnership with the county wasn't considered, but if we can include that, I certainly see it as a benefit. I've always struggled with understanding the Hennepin County model where every city for themselves and you got to figure out your own way to do things. I've always found the Dakota County model to be something that other parts of the region should emulate because it works really well. I mean, when there isn't a fight when developments go in because everybody knows that they're well run when the county puts their name on them. And when something goes in, everyone in the county is paying for it, whether it goes in West St. Paul or Lakeville or Hastings or whatever. Every taxpayer in the county is contributing, not just the community that it came from. And it works well. So if we can recognize that, that's great.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I would just note that a scoring criteria based on that relationship then to start to level the playing field a little more between the more rural parts of the metro and the more urban. Anyone else comment? Councilmember Chambliss.
I just wanted to say ditto to working with the counties. Partnership when we have limited resources, I think is the way to go.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I would just also lift up, my approach is generally simpler is better. And so I think simpler for everybody is better. So overall, so I would just echo what Councilmember Wolf said earlier. Well, any further comments on this item? And Any further? Ms. Lovelace, are you getting what you need out of this discussion?
I appreciate all of your comments. This was very helpful. Thank you, Chair Lilligren and council members.
Thank you. Thank you for your work on this, yeah. And I'm sure there's more to come. Council members, we will move on along on the agenda to our second information item. It's the Regional Park Systems Addition Project Process Update. And I know Mr. Mullen is on the call. I didn't know if I saw Mr. Kelly, so I would turn it over to either Mr. Mullen or Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair Lilligren, and thank you, members of the Community Development Committee. As you said, this is Emmett Mullen. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. We are back with the System Additions project. This is the Regional Parks Policy Plan update process, and we're focusing on system additions. As you know, we're here in April discussing this effort, and now we're back. In just a minute, Colin Kelly, who is on the line, will share a bit more about the system additions process and what's involved here. We take up this process every 4 years as directed by the state legislature. And this is a time when we need to take a step back as a council and take a hard look at our existing regional park system and consider what it should become, how it should grow. We, the council, have a nuanced role with this process. It's the regional park implementing agencies, those 10 agencies that actually propose system additions. And it's our responsibility to review the proposals and then decide which ones we'd like to go forward. So it's a really important role. The agencies right now are in the process of finalizing their system addition proposals or requests, and they'll be submitting them later this week. We'll definitely share these proposals with you so that you can look at the proposals in the agency's own words. They're actually going to be producing short videos for each of their proposals that we can also share that link with you so that you can learn more. So just to jump in, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, Greg. We have three simple parts to today's discussion. The first is Colin is going to cover the process and the policy foundation for the regional park system. I'm going to talk about this exciting new category of units called bridging facilities. And then Jessica Lee, who is also on the line, is going to talk about boundary adjustments. And we'll talk about each of these sections and we'll stop and there will be time for questions or comments or suggestions. So with that, I will pass this to Colin Kelly.
Mr.
Next slide, please.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Emmett. Can you hear me okay? This is Colin.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, you might recall at last month's CDC meeting, after a very brief introduction to system additions, I went straight to talking about our draft application for system additions. Well, in retrospect, it would have probably been helpful to provide a bit more background about the regional park system's statutory and policy frameworks and the system itself. So I aim to do that in brief over the next few slides, as Emmett said. So here's the first of those two slides focused on key legislation for the regional park system. This is from Minnesota Statutes section 473.121, Subdivision 14. It states in part that, quote, regional recreation open space means land and water areas and facilities determined by the Metropolitan Council to be of regional significance, or of regional importance, I should say, excuse me, in providing for a balanced system of public outdoor recreation for the metropolitan area, including, but not limited to, park reserves, major linear parks and trails, large recreation parks, and other special use facilities. Next slide, please. The next key piece of legislation that I'd like to focus your attention on here briefly is from section 473.137, Subdivision One. It states in part that the policy plan shall identify generally the areas which should be acquired by a public agency to provide a system of regional recreation open space, which, together with state facilities, reasonably will meet the outdoor recreation needs of the people of the metropolitan area. These two pieces of legislation point to both the council's role in providing for a balanced system of public outdoor recreation, as well as what our policy plan shall do in relation to that system. Next slide, please. That legislation and the council have been critical in framing what the regional park system has become today. In a nutshell, the regional park system offers natural resource-based settings, and more often than not, has a direct relationship with water. Lakes, rivers, creeks, streams, waterfalls, wetlands, you name it. Water is a major asset and attraction in the regional park system. Because of those great natural resource-based settings, the regional park system also offers some pretty amazing recreational opportunities. Hiking, biking, skiing, camping, canoeing, kayaking, fishing, swimming, and more. I could go on, but you get the idea. The regional park system, by its definition, is meant to serve a regional audience and often crosses city or township boundaries. These regional parks and park reserves are also bigger than your local or neighborhood park, oftentimes much bigger. Regional parks are typically more than 200 acres, and park reserves are at least 1,000 acres. These places protect significant natural resources, which provide the foundation for fun and healthy outdoor recreation opportunities. Because of that, and because of the vision that early park and trail planners and others had over 100 years ago, it is no surprise that the Twin Cities metropolitan area has been on the receiving end of some accolades for its interconnected regional park and trail system. Next slide, please. In addition to the legislation I referenced, the Council's 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan guides the work of the Metropolitan Council staff in our Regional Parks and Natural Resources Unit. Though there is more to the Parks Policy Plan than these 5 policies, as you might imagine, these policies are at the core of our work and the core of the system. Citing and acquisition policy. Identify lands with high-quality natural resources that are desirable for regional park system activities and put these lands in a protected status so they will be available for recreational uses and conservation purposes in perpetuity. This policy is fundamental to our work during the system additions process. Planning. Promote master planning and help provide integrated resource planning across jurisdictions. Recreational activities and facilities. Provide a regional system of recreational opportunities for all residents while maintaining the integrity of the natural resource base within the regional park system. Finance. Provide adequate and equitable funding for the regional park system units and facilities in a manner that provides the greatest possible benefits to the people of the region. Finally, system protection. Protect public investment in acquisition and development by assuring that every component in the system is able to fully carry out its designated role as long as a need for it can be demonstrated. Next slide, please. Next. Thank you. This is the regional park system today. It looks like we've gone ahead a little bit here. Greg, would you mind just going back a few slides or a few clicks there? Yep, let's go right there. Thank you. 44 regional parks from above the falls in Minneapolis to Whitetail Woods in Dakota County. Let's go with the next one, Greg. 12 park reserves from Baker in Hennepin County, the majority of which is also known as Three Rivers Park District, to Spring Lake in Dakota County. Next one, Greg. 8 special recreation features from Como Park Zoo in St. Paul to Square Lake in Washington County. And the next one. 49 regional trails from Birch Lake in Ramsey County to West Mississippi River in Three Rivers Park District. And one more, please. 10 regional park implementing agencies, which Emmett referred to earlier, from A to Z, Anoka County to Washington County. And the next slide, please. You've seen this one before. Let's talk about it just a little bit more right now. And so now that you've got a better sense of the key legislation and the policy that directs our work at the council and the system itself, let's focus in on system additions. So last month at the April CDC meeting, the second of the month, the yellow star was just a little further north in the develop and submit applications box. We've moved along a little bit here to the 18th of May. And I'd like to just point out a few things, a reminder, and then where we are going. First, though this graphic begins in February, this system additions project goes clear back to October of 2019, when we were meeting with our regional park implementing agency partners on a monthly basis. The focus of the pre-February process was on high-level trend areas and topics of regional, if not national, or maybe even international significance, including Minnesota's changing climate, changing demographics, contemporary recreation trends, geographic balance, and system funding considerations. But returning to the present, last month we shared that draft system additions application with you, and now that application will soon be drawing to a close. Application period, I should say. Emmett referenced that as well. Applications are due the day after tomorrow. In June, implementing agency partners will present their system addition proposals over the course of 2 meetings on June 4th and June 11th to the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, or MPOSC, and council staff will review and evaluate all of those proposals at the same time. Like Emmett said, again, if you're interested in viewing these June MPOSC meetings, please let us know. Come July, council staff will share a draft recommendation on system additions to MPOSC and you. In August, council staff will share the first of 2 business items with council committees, and off we go. Next slide, please. I mentioned the citing and acquisition policy previously, and its importance in our system additions process. Again, I won't go into all the details of these criteria tables here, but it is worth reiterating the policy statement. Identify lands with high quality natural resources that are desirable for regional park system activities and put these lands in a protected status so they will be available for recreational uses and conservation purposes in perpetuity. Next slide, please. These are some highlights of the strategies that sit within the citing and acquisition policy. Again, not going to get into all the details here, but this gets at key areas of importance in this system additions process. Strategy 1, priorities says, in a nutshell, future council designation of lands should emphasize natural resource features and access to water bodies. Strategy 2, geographic balance says, also in a nutshell, proportionate distribution tied to population distribution patterns will be an important consideration when exploring system additions. This strategy also expounds briefly on regional importance, saying that the legislative directive is clear that regional parklands should be of regional importance. Lands that serve only a municipality or neighborhood are not considered to have regional importance. Next slide, please. The other 2 strategies I'd like to reference briefly are strategy 4 and 5. Strategy 4 is new regional trails, and a few of the highlights include that they must serve a regional audience, should not duplicate an existing trail, should connect 2 or more units of the regional park system, and that they connect state or federal recreational units. Strategy 5 is special recreation features, and some of the key language that is there is that our special recreation features must be unique and complement or enhance the services already offered by the regional system, and that they not duplicate or compete with recreation facilities adequately provided by the public or private sector. Next slide, please. With that, we'd like to open up the discussion for a few minutes at least, and we have 2 questions for you to ponder. First, what does a mature or complete regional park system look like? Another way to put that might be, what do we want the regional park system to look like when it grows up? Related to that first question, are certain elements from the previous slides more important than others? And I'll just quickly point out that those slides focused on Chapter 4 of the policy plan, which relate to some of the park and trail system's inherent values: the protection of natural resources, access to water bodies, proximity to people, connections to destinations, and so on. Council staff are curious as to whether council members feel any of these particular strategies and associated values are more important than others. Of course, this may relate to your second question here as well. What is your guidance for MPOSC and staff as they review and evaluate system addition proposals next month? And with that, I will stop talking, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. And so now we will take some time to address the questions that Mr. Kelly put before us. So I would ask for council members to respond, please.
Councilmember Lilligren, could I just make a quick comment before? This is Emmett. Thank you. I just briefly wanted to say this is, we don't mean to overwhelm with information here, but we just wanted to be really clear that we view this as a really important council effort. And when we say council effort or council process, we mean your partners at the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, so our commissioners, who then feed into you, the Community Development Committee, as well as the entire Metropolitan Council. So we just wanted to make sure that was clear. And we also wanted to just reiterate the fact that these proposals are going to be marching forward into the June 4th and June 11th Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission meeting. And all of you are welcome to join us at that meeting to hear more about the proposal. So with that, I will stop and discuss questions. And I don't know if it would be helpful, Greg, to put the questions up in front of the group.
Thank you, Emmett. And so Councilmember Chambliss had requested the floor. Councilmember Chambliss.
Oh, thank you. So to me, the first question, what does a mature or complete regional system look like? I would say that over time, there should be more access and connections to our regional park systems from the city or the suburb or even areas that are further out. I know there are a lot of parks and trails, there are a lot of lakes, and Minnesotans are very much into the outdoors. I live one house away from a trail that goes to the Coon Rapids Dam. And in my neighborhood, there are many, many trails like that. And if we could ensure that as we build and develop, that we have more of those types of connections and access, to me, that means our regional park system is becoming more complete and more mature from the standpoint of access and use. We need to look at how people are moving around in the environment. What are their interests over time? How are those interests changing? And be able to adapt to those changes, adapt to the demographics, and make sure that we're keeping up so that we have the investments in our regional park system for years to come, because we have to make sure that as people change, as demographics change, the investments and the interest continue to improve.
Thank you, Councilmember. Other council members, it's a little hard to tell. Okay, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thanks, Chair. I'd just like to echo what Emmett said earlier, just to remind, because we're all, just wrapping our first year on the council, but just to remind staff that our relationship with MPOSC is different than it is with other council created groups. It's a state legislated group. We are equal partners in decision making with MPOSC, the implementing agencies, and as the council. So I just want to kind of make sure that we all are remembering that in the context of this conversation, and that's really clear as we respect the work of the commissioners. And I think it's great to point out what kinds of things you would like or think it would be good to hear from the commissioners as it relates to this topic. I just wanted to get that out there to make sure everybody's really aware of that as we continue in this conversation. And then I'd like to hear more from my colleagues about this.
Thank you, Councilmember. Committee members? Comments? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just appreciate the work that's going into this. My thoughts are, again, for the whole region, but in my district, there's some expansion up in the Crow Wing Rogers Park area. So it's been interesting to see how they've been doing public process around that with Three Rivers Park District. But generally, I would say this, as we, again, times upon us have made us think, how do we gather differently? What does recreation look like for all communities within the region, all cultures in the region, all people in the region? How do we be intentional about reaching out to people who may be underrepresented in the usage of our parks and be as inclusive as possible, making them as available as possible? I know in the transit working group that I'm on, we're trying to think about our bus systems and what's next and how do we move people around, and there's major challenges there, but just getting people to the parks who don't have their own transportation, which I know is different and not necessarily the jurisdiction of this piece of it, but they're all interconnected. So just maintaining the great system, and as we continue to evolve the system, expand the system, and rethink how we use the system, being as inclusive as possible, whether it be culture, age, race, ethnicity, wherever you're from, wherever you're not from, I don't care, just as inclusive as possible.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a really interesting discussion, and I appreciate Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen's clarification and also Councilmember Johnson's strong remarks regarding inclusivity. And I totally agree with you, Councilmember Johnson, on the inclusivity. I think that what makes our park system vibrant is the uniqueness that each portion of the system has. And so to the extent that we can continue to be unique, and not just a series of lookalikes, I think is important and a given, but I think it's something that we ought to applaud each of the portions of the system for. I also think it's a question that we need to pose to counties and cities and townships. I've been struck by the pride that Anoka and Washington and Ramsey counties, and those are counties that are a part of District 11, I've been struck by how strongly they embrace their role in this and their commitment to the park systems. I also want to note Dakota County. Dakota County's got an awesome commitment to its parks. And I know that through my involvement with Friends of the Mississippi River, and I'm sure it's true of the whole metro region. But I think that asking them to kind of talk to us about what they want the system to be when it grows up would be really beneficial.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion? Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I want to echo what Councilmember Vento said. I think it's important to have unique places that are regional draws. It's not just take the place of every local park, putting regional dollars into every local park. It's protecting special places in terms of the ecology, you know, being connected to water and natural spaces and whatnot, and having something to do there that's worth traveling for. You're not just only serving the local people, but it's the I mean, it's the basis of the regional park system is to have state park-like spaces in the metro. We don't get the same sort of funding that the state parks get, but that's the purpose of the regional park system, is to protect those natural spaces, give people access to them, and give them something to do while they're there that's unique and is worth traveling for a little bit to get to. We don't have to recreate the same thing in each place, but have something unique that's worth coming for. And collectively throughout the system, meet all of the types of things that people want to do in natural spaces in the metro area.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thanks, Chair. I want to also just point out that this includes trail systems as well. And so just keeping that in mind. I also, one of the things that I've observed over the little while I've been in my role on MPOSC and on the council is the perception of what is the right activity or activities inside of a regional park. And those things are defined by what has been most recently dominant cultural values in what to do in a regional park. So the right way to be outside is defined by a certain cultural context. So to echo what Councilmember Johnson said, is that we also need to take this opportunity to make sure that we are neutralizing dominance in defining what is a regional draw. So, for example, what is that thing that will bring people from a little farther away? We also have to remember that these regional facilities are also in people's backyards. So they walk a line between being someone's neighborhood and being a regional space. And that's something that we have to think about in a thoughtful way. And it makes sense to acknowledge that. If you could imagine you take a regional facility that's also in a community's backyard, and you can easily make that facility a space that the people who live closest to it no longer are comfortable participating in or visiting. And we actually have examples of that occurring right now. So those are some things that I just encourage my colleagues to think about as we're talking about regional facilities. How we've always, and I'm using air quotes, I'm using my fingers so people can see them, how we've always participated in regional parks isn't a shared norm across communities. And our communities change and are organic, and we need to be innovative and change with that as well.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I wasn't trying to imply that we should do the same things that we've always done. That wasn't what I was trying to say at all, but I would like to hear more about what you were saying about people being near to the parks, no longer feeling comfortable. I want to hear more about that if you'd be willing to share.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Sure, thank you. And Councilmember Wolf, actually my comment wasn't directed directly at you. We actually have had comments in MPOSC where that has talked about that as well, and it's a common thing that comes up when we start talking about, or in many of our communities, we even have organizations that reach out to us who want to preserve the right way of being in regional parks and define that in a very specific way that sometimes may be, for example, resistant to having paved trails in regional parks because they take away from the natural experience. But those are essential for providing more access for people with physical disabilities. That's one example. So it's something that I've just heard a lot. But I appreciate one of the young people who worked on the Citizens League project, to answer your question, talked about gentrification as the modification by people of privilege of public spaces to make them more comfortable for them, and as a result, displacing communities that live in that area. So examples might be replacing a basketball hoops inside a regional park with sand volleyball courts. And that's something that has happened in the last, 5-10 years in a regional park. And removing or downsizing picnic spaces inside of a regional park to accommodate smaller family sizes in a community that had lots of has more of a collective culture, and has larger family gatherings in the park, and downsizing those picnic spaces in a regional park to that more of a nuclear family size. That, what is that, 2.5 kids and a dog, instead of that more inclusive. We've received that feedback also about the types of usages inside regional parks and when they can become really dominant in a regional park. So I've gotten a lot of inquiries and concerns around, for example, cross-country skiing and mountain biking at Theodore Wirth Park is one example, because it's become so prolific that people from the community who are used to walking in the park in the winter or in the summer no longer feel comfortable or safe, or are told they cannot walk in places they used to walk, because they're either missing up the ski trail, or they're told, hey, you're getting in the way of my ride. Things like that. Some of that has to do with user behavior, is not the intent necessarily of those planning those park spaces, but it's something that changes the environment and makes it no longer welcoming to a community that may live adjacent to that park. Is that helpful examples?
It is, thank you.
Thanks. And so I'm not seeing any other committee members requesting the floor, so I'm going to weigh in here since you asked. What I would want the regional park system to be when it grows up is connected and accessible. And I think those are some themes that we've been hearing from other committee members as well. And Councilmember Chambas was really hitting that connections, and I know that that's a strategy to connect regional parks. I would just note, so I spent 12 years on the Minneapolis City Council. I represented a really core city district for most of those years. I have a core city district here on the Met Council, and the issue, my communities that I represent are mostly served by neighborhood parks, and so they're not really part of this conversation. But during my time on the City Council, it was a robust issue that I was raising a lot, how the regional park system, at least in the city of Minneapolis, was inherently inequitable because it wicked resources away from neighborhood parks that were to be more successful, more accessible and serving the core city neighborhoods. And so when we have strategies that say things like connect to a body of water, this came up when the ward I represented didn't have any bodies of water. And when you talk about Minneapolis as the city of lakes, that clearly prioritizes or emphasizes parts of the city with lakes. And so those areas that don't have bodies of water aren't really included in that. And I get a little bit of that vibe here. And so, when you're looking to really, Councilmember Johnson brought up the idea of transportation, and that's really not what we're talking about here. But when there aren't regional parks within communities or even close to communities, how do we make them accessible? And I'm not suggesting we start planning transportation into our regional parks planning, but I think it's important that we ask who has access. And so are there pieces of existing park infrastructure that can help be that connection? We now have the Minneapolis Chain of Lakes Regional Park, for example, put together a bunch of things that now are one regional park. Are there ways of thinking about that where we can actually start getting regional park access into the core city? And I know that there are issues of space, size, and but I don't believe we will really ever have a truly equitably accessible regional park system unless we figure out some ways to connect populations in the core city to the regional parks. They're just not here. So, yeah. So those are my 2 cents. And now I see Councilmember Chambas would like to speak. Councilmember Chambas.
Yes. One of the things that I would like to see is for the long-term interest of regional parks, particularly of people who are not gravitating towards our regional parks, is education. And education and access early. I've said this in a few meetings. I would like to see more of our communities of color, the youth in our communities of color, exposed to regional parks, exposed to elements of nature, whether it be water or parks and trails or everything that kind of would steer them towards the appreciation of our regional parks and the understanding of the beauty and the value, just like we have for music appreciation, we can have the appreciation for nature, and a lot of times it's based on exposure. And sometimes you have to meet people where they are, which, for example, there's a project that's being proposed for enhancing the North Commons area in North Minneapolis. And, I was approached and I said, it'd be really nice if, in your community center, you had a way to educate people about the rivers and streams that flow through their neighborhood into, Theodore Worth. So that's a way of connecting, that's a way of educating, and it might be a way of thinking outside the box. So that the future is more of parks usage is more inclusive. So that's what I would like to see is how can we make those connections so that more people have access.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was just one more thing about trails. As we add more trails to the regional system, if we are adding new trails that are more natural in design, where they're going through, forest or along waterways or whatever, if there is a nearby trail that's running along the side of a arterial road or something, I think it's important that that when we add the more natural trail, that we remove the one that's along the side of the road if there's nearby. We've had in the Parks Policy Plan in the past guidelines about distance between different regional trails. You don't want to have them all right next to each other. And there are some places where parks agencies have wanted to add trails, and there's one running along the side of an arterial roadway in near proximity. And I think it's important to make sure that we don't have too many too close together, because we can't afford to pay for all of them. And if we're going to be using park money for it, it needs to be more nature-based and not transportation-based. We have the Transportation Policy Plan and transportation funding for ones that are purely transportation-based, and focus our recreational dollars on the ones that are recreational where we can.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Johnson.
And just briefly, and maybe this is for Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen or others, because I'm mostly familiar with Three Rivers Park District, and I know quite a while ago they did the programming where bringing the parks to where the people are, meeting people where they're at, and taking the parks into neighborhoods that didn't have access or convenient access or weren't being accessed by community. And I'm just wondering, is that part of this planning process? Are other park implementing agencies doing that? And yet I don't ever want to say that's a substitute for being better at connecting people to the park. But I know it was one thing that they were trying to do years ago, and they still do it.
Chair, this is Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
And I think Councilmember Wolf wants to weigh in too. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Sure. I would actually encourage Colin or Emmett to provide some clarification, but I want to just just to make sure, double check I'm right. But I'd also say that a big part of Three Rivers taking those actions is they have inner ring suburbs that they serve that actually don't have access physically to many regional facilities outside of trails in many situations, or are pretty far out from the physical large regional park locations. So if you think of those that I represent, that Councilmember Lilligren and Cummings, and I'm forgetting somebody, you probably, maybe parts of yours or other communities, that is a common occurrence in some of the implementing agencies, but particularly Three Rivers has that scenario. And so they have done work to build some regional presence at in Golden Valley in particular, and are working in other communities as well. I think in Councilmember Chambliss's community too. However, I think innovative approaches is also a part of the bridging portion. And I believe that is part of the intent as well. And I just want to remind the council, the previous council did identify specific dollars to advance equity, but it was tied to capital projects. And every time we talk about this, people talk about the need for programming, because it's truly programming that connects people to the outdoors, and people who connect. Let me say that differently. It's actually people who connect people to the outdoors. And that is so important in marketing. And that is something that MPOSC talks about regularly, would really like to see us make some movements on. With that, I'll yield to either Colin to confirm or maybe Councilmember Wolf as well.
Councilmember Wolf, did you have something to contribute here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think all of the implementing agencies partner with school districts to expose kids to the regional parks. That's a really common thing, because you can collect up the kids from school, put them on a bus and take them to whatever regional park. That's how my kids found out what regional parks were, going to Chutes and Ladders and all sorts of different places around the metro. And I would also add that it's not just the inner parts of the 7-county metro area that don't have access to parks. I know in Elko Newmarket, they're a very small community. They don't even have a parks and recreation department. So what access to programs that their kids have come from Three Rivers coming and presenting programs in the parks in Elko Newmarket. So it's not just regional parks, but they're also bringing programs to city parks in places that don't have those, to expose kids to park programming.
Thank you, Councilmember. Emmett, did Emmett or Colin have anything to add to this? I know Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen was looking to be clarified if she was giving incorrect information. Do you guys have anything to add?
I'll just add, Councilmember or Chair Lilligren, no, what Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen was saying really resonated with me. The idea that it's people that connect people to the outdoors, the importance of programming in order to connect communities is a critical strategy, and one that only is becoming, I feel, more important with the agencies, that as they mature and evolve, that's an area that they're really interested in. Certainly they can't do it all, and so that's why those partnerships are so critical. I'll stop there. You're teeing up the next section of the presentation
perfectly. I was just going to point that out, Emma. Yeah, let's move into the next section. I'll note also that at about 6, Councilmember Mouze had to leave at 6.
Thank you.
The 6 now.
Greg, if you could put the PowerPoint back up and move to the next section. So next up are bridging facilities, and your questions and your discussion around equity, inclusion, and intentional strategies to ensure that all people feel connected is right where bridging facilities emerged. So this idea for bridging facilities, and I don't want to get technical, but so we have regional parks, we have park reserves, we have regional trails, and then there's this thing called special recreation features. And bridging facilities are a subset of special recreation features. These are sort of specialized or single-purpose recreational facilities that provide opportunities. So we've had this idea. It emerged in 2015 through the 2015 Regional Parks Policy Plan update and the Thrive Equity Strategies. And this idea came out, and the agencies were like, "Oh, that's interesting. What is a bridging facility?" And so we have been thinking and discussing this idea for a while now, and now we're really looking to, during this system additions process, to actually add some bridging facilities to the system. So let's go to the next slide. So the goal of bridging facilities, this subset of special recreation features, is to introduce and link new regional park and trail visitors across age, race, ethnicity, national origin, income, and that the idea is that these facilities engage people with the wide of amazing opportunities that exist through the regional park system, through innovative strategies and partnerships. So next slide, please. With this system additions process, we're trying to better define what bridging facilities are. So we've been working with the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission and with the regional park implementing agencies to do just that. So one really important part, and Chair Lilligren, you just nailed it when you were talking about the tension that sometimes exists between funding the regional park system and local parks. But bridging facilities are really meant to be different from local parks and different from community centers because their purpose is tied implicitly to introducing new visitors to our regional parks and trails. They have a real equity intention that they're trying to address inequities that have existed in our region, such as lower participation rates from some communities. There is also a real emphasis on the future stewards of our region, as we think about young adults, teenagers, and children. That's certainly a really important audience for us. There's also an idea about bridging facilities that they should be sited close to the audience that you're trying to reach, including historically underserved communities. And to Council Member Wolf and Vento's point, this is not intended to be a one-size-fits-all approach, that the uniqueness of these is really critical. Next slide, please. So as we work to better define these in this system additions Parks Policy Plan update, here's some new language that we're proposing. And it's bridging facilities will really provide a clear statement of purpose for what the facility is intended to accomplish, that it'll identify the population to be better served and the inequity to be addressed. Again, that these facilities are sited close to the desired population, the population that you're trying to reach. Very much like the other units in our regional parks and trail system, they'll have to have an approved master plan. And within that master plan, there will need to be an awareness building effort or a marketing plan. And it will include a programming plan, both active and passive. These are exactly the things you were just talking about. I mentioned active and passive because I just think of the expense of staff. This is something that Councilmember Johnson has mentioned in the past. that you got to be really careful to not add too many tails, because we do struggle with affording our system. We're proposing this currently to not be included in the annual use estimate. And you may ask, why is that? The idea is that by not including the bridging facilities in the use estimate is if they do what they're designed to do, their success will be reflected in the increased visitation to regional parks and trails. This was a little bit of a nod to the smaller agencies, the idea that we want to make sure that this doesn't just result in the bigger agencies getting bigger and the smaller agencies getting smaller. I've got some more to say about that, but I'm just gonna keep moving at this time. Next slide, please. The bridging facilities may. So they can be standalone facilities located perhaps in an area not currently well served by existing regional parks, park reserves, and regional trails. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen was just mentioning some of those first and second tier suburbs in Hennepin County that don't really have a lot of, especially regional parks. They could be nested within an existing regional park or park reserve or special recreation feature or regional trail. So like they're designed to maybe drive or teach skills or introduce new people into the opportunities that exist in the larger facility. And then this last bullet is just around having a mobile element to allow outreach to extend beyond existing boundaries of the regional park system, to actually go into the communities that you're trying to reach. Next slide, please. So we've been meeting for multiple meetings with the agencies to discuss this. And I just wanted to reiterate that there's really strong support and excitement for increasing equitable use. Some concerns do remain with the agencies, and they really rest with, have we clearly defined what bridging facilities are? Have we adequately differentiated them from local parks and trails? How do we ensure regional significance, that really unique feature that when Councilmember Wolf said they're like the state parks of the metro area, that's really critical. The underlying point here is also that we don't want to open the door to funding local parks, because honestly, we couldn't do that. It's challenging to afford the system we have. Another concern that was raised is the special recreation feature categorization adequate? What does the subset of bridging facilities add to the system? Or, excuse me, what I meant to say is should we just have special recreation features and that's enough? Or do we really need this as an additional subset of that? And then there's been questions about, should bridging facilities be included in the annual use estimate? So this is what I was foreshadowing earlier. And the current proposal does not recommend doing the annual use estimate in these. And a really important point that many of people have raised is that it's so important that we know whether we're reaching the communities we're seeking to better serve. So including them in that annual use count is really critical. Now I'm just gonna, next slide, please. I'll go over a few takeaways from our Parks and Open Space Commission meeting. And as you know, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen is part of these conversations as our liaison. But generally speaking, the Parks and Open Space Commission voiced support for bridging facilities. There was a feeling like, okay, we created this idea in 2015. Let's go forward. Let's do something here. There was several excellent points that the intent behind the bridging facility is really critical, and we need to be articulate around who we're seeking to better serve. They too said what others have said, don't open the door to funding local parks and community centers. And then make sure you're evaluating bridging facilities. How are you going to know if they're successful? Make sure that you're reaching that target audience. So I think they were sort of saying, as such, really include them in the annual use estimate, because that's going to be your best measure as to whether they're successful. Next slide, please. So this is our two questions around bridging facilities, and I'm sensitive to the fact that it's 6:30. So does the proposed language clearly define the bridging facility concepts? If not, do you have suggestions for strengthening it? And then finally, how do we ensure that bridging facilities do not open the door to local parks and community centers? Thank you. Any thoughts? If you keep these slides up, Greg, that'd be great.
Oh.
Just thinking that maybe because then people will remember the questions.
Chair Lilligren, do you want the slides up? I know it's hard to see.
Fine. Either or, maybe alternate back and forth. It is harder to see who wants to speak, but it's important that people see the questions. So maybe put them up for a minute or so, take them down. Okay. Councilmember Lindstrom, I forgot you were here. I wasn't counting you, so we actually are at 7, which is great. So Councilmember Lindstrom, then Councilmember Bento, then Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson. Councilmember Lindstrom.
I'm alive and well, Mr. Chair.
I'm glad to hear it. Glad to see it.
Emmett, I'm hoping when you're thinking about these bridging facilities, what for you comes to mind as more concrete examples? Are there examples that you're thinking of things across the nation? I mean, do other park systems have bridging facilities? Like, be a little bit more specific. Well, I understand it could be in a current park, or it could be a standalone thing, but give some examples of the things that that could be included.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember Lindstrom, for that question. That picture that was just in that slide was of Tamarack Nature Center that's located in Bald Eagle Otter Regional Park. And it's this amazing nature center that actually has a nature center preschool in it. And this facility really brings young people in and teaches them from a very young age about the natural world. And so I didn't mean to tip that, oh, Ramsey County's perfect because they have this amazing facility, but I think that's a great example. Another example might be, and this is just because I know the Minnehaha Parkway Regional Trail, but as it runs by Lake Nokomis, there's an old torn up tennis court where the Minneapolis Park Board has put this sort of learn to ride bike, I call it a bike rodeo place where kids can go and learn to ride their bike safely. And it's right next to this regional park. It's right along the Minnehaha Parkway Regional Trail. And so you can kind of practice on that area a few times and then get launched out into the bigger system. So those are two examples that I'm hoping might give you a little bit better idea, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. Is that a Councilmember Lindstrom?
That's good. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. You bet. Councilmember Bento, then Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson.
Mr. Chair, I have yet another weird question. I'm kind of curious as to not so much bridging facilities as bridging opportunities. Again, as a former educator, many moons ago, when Peter Lindstrom and his younger sister were very young, I recall going with my students out to the Wilmer Community College. These were third graders, and the incredible experience they would get as third graders with the community college faculty from the science department, and getting out and seeing water and plants and insects and critters, and they just had the best experiences. And one of the joys in my life the last 20 years has been being a part of a couple of different nonprofits that try to help get kids engaged. So one of the things I would suggest as we have this conversation is that we invite nonprofits that are a part of the bridging of young people and nature to be a part of this conversation and help us discern the best direction to go. I think of any number of local and regional and national groups that are out there working really hard every day, even in the midst of this pandemic, to help give kids an outdoor experience. And I know locally, many of them have partnered with the schools to align that outdoor experience with curriculum goals so that the kids aren't just going on a field trip, they are on an outdoor learning experience, and they walk away with just incredible lifetime opportunities to continue to engage. A year ago, I was a part of one of those experiences with some fourth graders, and it was interesting because a few weeks later, I was walking my dog through that same area, and this little boy came rushing up to me, and he's, Mrs. Vento, I met you a couple weeks ago, and I just want you to know I brought my parents here today. And I was so struck that this kid was so impacted by that park experience and that learning experience that he brought his parents back there. So I just want to offer that as a suggestion for a way that we can broaden this conversation and maybe even enrich it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, council members, for all your contributions. Emmett, I have one question. Can you share a clarifying question? Three Rivers had an innovative park that they put in place. And I can never say the name of this park correctly. It's just off of 55. We call it the Ninja Warrior Park in our family. And I think many people in the metro area do, but it's part on the trail, the Loose Line Trail. Emmett, was that park Golden Valley Park property prior to the Ninja Warrior playground going in, or was that always Three Rivers property?
Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson, is this Sohaki Park?
Thank you. Yes, I am always nervous to pronounce the name of that park. Yes.
And this was, I'm not sure about this, but my understanding is that was once a City of Robbinsdale, City of Golden Valley Park, and now it is jointly managed in partnership with Three Rivers Park District. And it is not currently part of our regional park system. But my understanding is that Three Rivers is considering submitting an application to make that a bridging facility. So I don't know what your influence is here on that, but that is one of the at least ideas that I've heard floated.
Yeah, I thank you, Emmett, for that. I was inspired by Councilmember Lindstrom's question about some examples. And particularly when we look at areas where there may be a regional park and an opportunity to put in a unique feature that brings in a population maybe who has been underserved, or maybe there's not the physical space for a 1,000-acre regional park, but can help capture the imagination and connect people to the outdoors through something that's innovative. And I think that's a great example. So maybe, Emmett, that's something you could share with folks so they could take a look. And there's been articles written about this park because it's been so popular and is very small. And I would probably guess in the context of investments as well, but is a good example of what one type of bridging facilities could look like that I think would be good to highlight. But the other reason why I'm bringing that up is the importance of partnering with local communities. And so I think it would be a shame for us to not think about how local communities can add and be enriched and enrich a regional facility, whether it's through highlighting a unique cultural aspect if you look nationally, for example, there's some national regional parks that use history of specific cultural groups who've been underrepresented, or even in our own work, highlighting indigenous communities and cultural traditions that are represented in parks as a part of healing as well as educating. So I just think that one thing I would ask people to consider is around the aspect of not opening the door to local parks or community centers is maybe wondering, can we frame that in the context to make sure we're innovating? And of course, we're not here to fund local parks, but if there's great opportunities to leverage local facilities and communities, shouldn't we be partnering for that innovation?
Thank you, Councilmember. Other comments? Peter, were you raising your hand? Nope. Okay. And Judy, did you just raise your hand? Did I? Nope. Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to kind of follow up on what Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson said. You know, we don't know going forward what's going to happen in terms of funding at all levels. So I think remaining open on this idea is really important. We may find for any number of reasons that that kind of partnering is invaluable.
Councilmember Lilligren, could I respond just very briefly?
Please, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Councilmember Vento and Atlas Ingebretson. I actually found your comments very complimentary. I think that a number of these bridging facility proposals won't be asking for new acquisition funding, won't be asking necessarily for new development funding, but that they're gonna be these facilities that really seek to better program them, teach skills, or maybe introduce people to natural experiences in a way that that these local, like Sohaki is located in a floodplain, and it runs through a couple neighborhoods, and but it is this amazing natural experience, small scale, but it could be a really good example. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. And just to put in my 2 cents again on the questions, I think the proposed language is pretty good at defining bridging facility concepts. I mean, it's going to have to be evaluated, used as projects come forward or proposals come forward or ideas come forward, and it can't be so prescriptive and restrictive that, so I think it, you know, to me, it strikes a pretty good balance between defining what we're talking about and giving us space to live in the real world. And I think on the second questions, and I want to be really clear, I was at no point ever suggesting that we start funding local parks or community centers. Excuse me, but I do think as we define this, and we need to be aware of the impacts within the local communities and within the implementing agencies. And I'll just go back to my experience. Again, this was municipal government. We play different roles now, and I understand that. But it really did illustrate to me that in the city of Minneapolis, we had an inherently inequitable, demonstrably inherently inequitable two-system system. And it literally wicked money away from the local neighborhood parks into the regional park system. That was their decision within the implementing agency, Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, but it was a pact, and that to me creates incredible vulnerabilities it creates exposure if we're actually promoting and funding an inequitable system. And so as we kind of figure out what this means and acknowledge that we're not trying to fund local parks or community centers, which I support, we need to make sure that we're not contributing to reinforcing or building a continually inequitable system. And I just think for, you know, good business sense, it creates exposure to either our organization, the implementing organizations. That's my 2 cents. you want to
Sure.
take it
Well,
from here?
I just want to thank the committee. I am wondering if you would like us, because it's late, to come back another time and talk about the boundary adjustments. It's a small part of the presentation, but we're happy to do that.
Right, and we're down to, I think it is 5 now, if I'm not mistaken. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you're getting a more and more limited perspective. I might turn to Director Barajas actually and maybe seek some guidance here. How do committee members feel? Do you want to push through? Is it better for you guys, Emmett, if you have more voices that are contributing? Lisa, what do you think?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. We fully recognize that it is getting late, and I don't know about you, but I don't do my best thinking at the end of the day. So we know that on the boundary adjustments conversation, because it's about what's in and what's not, and when we take those applications, it might be better to come at that with fresh eyes and with a fuller group.
Great. Okay. Are people cool with that? Okay. Very cool. All right. Let's do that. Emmett and your team, thanks so much. This has really been a rewarding policy discussion, and it always feels good when we're actually discussing policy. So
thank you all. I really appreciate. I thought this was an excellent conversation too. So I appreciate everybody's comments today.
Great. Great. And then committee members, I had offered and talked to Director Barajas earlier about a report on the encampments. I don't know, in the light of the hour, if you want to hear that, or maybe if we could, yeah, I'm seeing a couple nodding heads. Lisa, do you feel comfortable going forward?
Sure, I'll keep it brief, and I'm certainly happy to follow up with anybody afterwards too if you have any other questions. But just really quickly, the encampment is on Metropolitan Council property that's located on Hiawatha and on approximately 28th, 29th Street. It's right on the Midtown Greenway Trail, just to the east of the Martin Olav Sabo Bridge that crosses Hiawatha there. We have, since the initial stay-at-home order that the governor put in place, have seen an increase of folks camping on that property, and we've worked to socially distance appropriately following CDC guidance for encampments for homelessness or populations experiencing homelessness, so that we could both prevent community spread, but also ensure that to the extent that we can create a safer and healthier environment, however temporary it may be, before folks are able to move on to better and safer housing and shelter options. So since the stay-at-home order was in place, we've seen a decline in the number of tents there. We are at a high of about 75, and now we're at about 60 or so. It's still not ideal, and we have been working to provide connecting with other partners, local government and service agencies to provide some interim supports as we work to connect folks to a variety of housing and shelter options that meet their needs. So I will say it's a lot of work, it's a lot of coordination, and there's not an easy switch that we can turn on or off to solve all of the problems. I mean, housing, as you all know, was already an issue before the pandemic, and certainly homelessness was as well. And this, I think, just puts a sharper focus on the issues that we are already facing in this region, and now it just happens to be on our property as well.
Thank you. Questions? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, thank you, Lisa, for leading that. And I've been through either council communications, but also just in the news, reading things, and I appreciate that. And it's not a now thing, but this pandemic, it's not a one and done. So as we come into colder weather in the fall again, here we go again. So whatever we can do at the council on policy, funding, it's hard, but the immediacy of the problem, but then what can we be doing to support you and everybody else out there, the partners in solving and preventing homelessness, but also as we have the long game here, how to get ahead. Whatever you need, I'm sure all of us would be willing to do whatever you need.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Councilmember, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Chambliss.
Oh, thank you. I have a question. You were talking about making sure that there's social distancing in the environment, also making sure that the environment is healthy. Can you speak more to what is being done to make the environment healthy? You know, bathroom facilities, washing facilities, and then also what about safety? I understand that, you know, there was fencing put around so that there would be a little bit more control about safety.
Mr. Chair, council members, that's a really good point. I do want to emphasize that this is not the safest environment and it's not the healthiest environment, but we are doing what we can to improve the conditions for health and safety of residents there. So what we have done to one point that you made is that we have put in fencing partly because we were seeing tents in places that were not safe. There's a power substation right nearby. There's, you know, our light rail tracks run up on the northern portion of this as well. So we really wanted to prevent folks from spilling into unsafe locations. And also we were experiencing some evening activities that were victimizing folks at the encampment as well. So fencing was one element that we provide, but our Metro Transit Police Department has just been doing yeoman's work and providing 24/7 monitoring and support of residents on the site, making sure that things are taken care of and helping to coordinate on site with our other agency partners. So we've also worked with and provided porta potties on site and hand washing stations, which we continue to service and regularly work out details on. And we are working with agency partners on other things like connecting residents to food choices that are available in the surrounding neighborhood as well.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for that update. Thanks for your work on this, Lisa. And this really affects me in my day job and in my regular life as well. It's only a few blocks from the 2018 Franklin Hiawatha encampment, a similar issue, similar populations. And so it's an incredible part of the issue here is that, yes, this is on our property, but nobody really manages camps within our system. And since 2018 in the Franklin Hiawatha encampment, there have been efforts at the state level through the Minneapolis Interagency Council on Homelessness to regionalize this effort. And I'm just really proud that Met Council continues to kind of step in to regional, what our role in a regional system may be. Lisa's been an appointed point person to have a highly placed executive from within our organization engaged now. The community is really stepping in, and it's there at this point right now there are no good choices. So we're always kind of evaluating the best of a lot of difficult choices. But I love what you said, Councilmember Johnson, about having a plan. And at the community level, we've been putting together sort of community priorities, what our part of a plan looks like. And we've been encouraging the public sector and philanthropy and private sector to sort of engage in that kind of planning. And I don't think we can use the excuse anymore that we don't do that. Nobody does this. Nobody takes care of camps. And so we're doing our part and trying to figure out, at least with this one that's on our property, what we can do, but really defining that regional roles. So I'm really proud of the Met Council, Met Transit, what folks have been doing, and the partnerships with the community. I mean, you see these on the ground, you guys. These are authentic partnerships with community-based organizations that are helping to support the population there. It's really something. Well, anything else, Michelle? I know you have a housekeeping issue. Did you want to jump in now?
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Chair Lilligren. I do have a housekeeping issue. Roll call was conducted to approve the minutes, but unfortunately I did not record who motioned and second to approve the minutes. So if you recall, or if someone recalls, or you could just repeat it, I appreciate it. Thank you.
This is Pete. I made the motion.
Great.
This is Sue. I think I seconded it.
Thank you very much, council members. My apologies. Have a great night. Thank you.
Please. It was a bumpy start. Great.
Thank you.
Don't apologize, please, Michelle. Lisa, anything else? Committee members, anything else? All right. Seeing no further business before this committee, we're adjourned. Take care.